The first words Susan spoke the morning after she left my seaside house felt like the beginning of a long, necessary war. "We don't move alone, Mr. Derechov. We move with witnesses, with records, with a plan that doesn't let them bulldoze the truth back into the sand." She said it quietly, the way surgeons speak when they are about to operate. I understood instantly. This was not a legal hiccup to be patched with apologies and polite handshakes. This was a nervous system devoted to control, and it needed to be cut cleanly at the root. The second paragraph I want to begin with cannot be modest. The world I was about to walk back into, the one where my son had smiled at my funeral as if choosing a winner, was wider and more dangerous than any house dispute. It contained men who wore patience like jewelry. It contained accountants who could hide a fraud inside a line item and make it look like housekeeping. It contained reputations bought and sold in hushed lunchrooms. To take them apart required a slow, methodical violence, the kind Susan practiced with the stubborn joy of a woman who'd seen too many people crushed by invisible hands. My first act, under her advice, was not to threaten. It was to document, to build a case like a scaffold tall enough to support a building that had been designed to fall. We began at dawn, with coffee and a stack of files that smelled faintly of the sea and old paper, and we bent over those papers like people who had been given the coordinates to a sunken treasure. I will not pretend the first 2 weeks were glamorous. They were not. They were fluorescent light long days in sterile rooms, coffee that turned into mere water, calls that made my hand tremble. The files yielded names, bank routing numbers, subtle transfers that looped through shell accounts and reappeared as consulting fees paid to companies owned by friends of Carla's. A notarized invoice, a seemingly banal reimbursement, a wire transfer timed the week before a family vacation, tiny threads that, when woven together, showed the pattern of a man who had treated family finances as his private buffet. Susan's face would go hard when she found something useful. She would look at me for a moment, an expression that asked for permission to do harm in my name. I gave it every time. There were other players. I met Alina, a young forensic accountant Susan recommended, small, fierce, with glasses sliding down her nose as though they were anchored to purpose. Alina clawed at spreadsheets the way my old hands had once combed through ledgers at midnight. Her discoveries were surgical: duplicated invoices with different payees, an unusual pattern of petty cash withdrawals that aggregated into sums large enough to buy shame. Where Daniel had once been allowed to wave off questions with a wine-sweet smile, Alina produced bank statements that smelled of cold iron. One morning she looked up from a laptop and said, simply, "He's not just sloppy, he's deliberate." She hit a fluorescent marker across the screen and the numbers glowed like a warning. While we gathered paper, Susan began to whisper to other mouths. She called a contact at the local paper, an editor named Rafik who had a reputation for investigative pieces that made the kind of people with everything to lose very uncomfortable at breakfast. Rafik came with a reporter, Jess, hard-nosed, hair chopped close, a notebook like armor. I felt exposed when they came to the house at first. There is nothing like the sound of a recorded voice to make you thin. Yet when I told them what I had found, Jess did not look shocked. She looked hungry. "We will not run a story that only shames," she told me. "We run a story that demands answers." That was precisely what Susan had wanted, not a scandal as entertainment, but truth as mechanism. News is a blunt instrument if you swing it without care. I watched Rafik's team do it with the care of craftsmen. An initial piece aired quietly, an exploration of elder mistreatment in estate sales, but it had teeth. It asked questions about convenience sales, about the speed with which family homes were moved through hands. Letters came from neighbors. A local bank asked for clarification. Overnight, the atmosphere changed. Daniel called twice that day, and both times I let the calls roll to the machine. I was no longer the man who picked up the phone and let fury rule my tone. Fury was useful when harnessed. Rage unbound was waste. But Daniel did not wait for press to do the work. He struck first in the way that men who believe in their immunity do. He sought to discredit the frame. He sent a lawyer, a young, brittle woman named Amelia with a sharp bob and a voice that tried too hard to land like steel. Amelia threatened countersuits for defamation if we so much as suggested impropriety without absolute proof. It was a theater of thin men throwing paper at one another. Susan, unbothered, replied with legal precision, "You will be hearing from the subpoena." The word alone made Amelia's jaw tighten. The side effects of our quiet campaign were immediate and vicious. Daniel lost a contract with a supplier who decided public association with scandal would be bad for business. He called me, breathless and angry. "You're killing me, old man." He sounded small. The man's arrogance had hinged upon the assumption I would always be small and pliant. The collapse of that assumption turned him fragile. There were nights I would not sleep. My grandson would call, asking awkward questions about why Grandpa never came to their barbecue anymore. I would lie, it seemed kind, and tell him I was busy with some paperwork. The truth was heavy. It had weight like tied stones. Part of me delighted in the precision of our moves. Part of me grieved that my family had to become a courtroom. Margaret in the letter had said something about dignity. I had thought then she meant the outward-facing kind. Now I understood she wanted a dignity that did not bend when wealthy hands picked at you. The campaign widened. Alina found an email chain where Daniel and a partner at one of his small companies discussed reallocating family funds and minimizing appearances. The vocabulary had the casual cruelty of men who had normalized theft as business sense. Susan prepared the papers for a civil suit, claims for misappropriation of estate assets, requests for forensic accounting, and a motion to freeze accounts that looked suspicious. For legal reasons, I will not state every detail here, but Susan's motions were comprehensive, cold, and surgical. The judge assigned to our initial hearing, an efficient woman named Judge Romano, read the materials and set an emergency review. The air in the courtroom smelled like old wood and judgment. Daniel sat in the back, his face tight as the suit he wore. I sat up front, calm. What no one expected was the counterpunch Daniel would attempt overnight. He did not move in the obvious places. He attacked the narrative by trying to rewrite the context. He leaked a carefully curated set of social media posts showing him tenderly caring for Margaret in a year's montage, photos of him holding her hand, of him at bedside, images cropped and softened to create a biography of devotion. The public is merciful when it has pictures, and for a brief, disconcerting moment, it seemed the old reflexes might triumph. People like stories with heroes, not villains. But the leak had been predictable in another way. In creating a public appearance of devoted son, Daniel disgorged a trail, timestamps, camera IDs, the metadata of images that were meant to be invisible. Alina traced one cropped image back to a device that belonged to a property manager who had been paid by Daniel for maintenance oversight. She texted me a single line. "He's trying to paint himself as a saint. We'll show the Savior painted by his own hand." The crispness of her reply made me laugh despite the taste in my mouth. The afternoon before the emergency hearing, I received an unexpected visitor. He arrived not with lawyers or scandal journalists, but with small, careful steps that suggested he belonged to another world. His name was Victor Popov, an old man from Margaret's past who had once run cargo ships and knew how to read the sea and men who sailed it. Margaret had kept his card in a place only she and I knew. She had trusted him like family. Victor was weathered, hands like knuckles of maps. He had driven across 2 counties to speak quietly. "You don't need more suits," he said when he sat at my kitchen table, his voice like gravel. "You need people who remember the old rules, people who keep secrets until they're useful." He unfolded a thin envelope and slid it to me. Inside were photographs, discrete images of a man meeting with other men in a diner, of a ledger exchanged for cash. Victor had sources. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I'm offering a ledger you can use." I kept my face blank, but inside something warm and crooked bloomed, like a map to a door I didn't know existed. The day of the hearing opened without fanfare. Judge Romano allowed only a brief presentation. Legal motions in these matters are often a matter of discretion. Susan walked through our case with an economy that made the room hold its breath. She described the transfers, the shell accounts, the timeline of missing funds. She asked the court to freeze certain accounts pending a full audit. The judge, after a lengthy pause, agreed to an emergency freeze on accounts under explicit suspicion. The clerk stamped the order, and for a moment the room felt like it had been turned upright again. Daniel did not make noise during the ruling. He sat pale as paper. When the bailiff asked him to remain available for questioning, his jaw trembled. He left without a word. I thought for a moment of calling after him, of yelling that I was better now, that there was nothing to take from me. I let the moment be. The world had finally measured him for what he was. Outside the courthouse, a pack of journalists milled like gaunt birds. Jess approached me with a microphone extended and a look that, for once, I felt comfortable with. "Mr. Derechov," she asked, "what do you want people to know?" The cameras wanted a line. They wanted a sermon. I looked out over the crowd and thought about Margaret, about the way she had written my name on a page and then disappeared like smoke. I thought about dignity. I thought of silence. "That I am not invisible," I said, and the statement landed like a stone skimming water. It was not a confession. It was a claim. For a little while the world shifted. Friends I hadn't heard from called to offer help. Neighbors left casseroles. A woman I barely knew from the gardening club asked if I needed someone to accompany me to the bank. The small kindnesses were a salve, but kindness does not dismantle fraud. Momentum does. That night I slept in the smaller bedroom of the coastal house, the ocean a slow drum beneath the windows. My phone, which had sat silent in the drawer for far too long, buzzed close to dawn. The screen flashed Daniel's name and a message that made blood crawl cold. "If you set that freeze in motion, you will watch everything you love burn. Watch your back." It was a threat thinly disguised as a promise. I set the phone down and opened Margaret's letter again. Her handwriting was more jagged than I remembered, but the message was crisp. "They will threaten the house," she had written. "They will threaten me. They think fear will make you small. Let them find out what small looks like when it is prepared." Prepared, yes, but threat is more than paper. In the dark I thought of Victor's ledger, of Alina's numbers, of Susan's motions. I thought of the man I had been before life taught me patience, a man not without impulse. And in that thought was a decision that settled like frost over my stomach. I would do more than freeze accounts. I would not just call witnesses. I would expose what they had done publicly and in ways that would ensure there was no simple retreat. They would not have the chance to sweep the sand over tracks. I rose before dawn and walked the porch, wind pinning my coat to my legs. The sea looked black and vast. It felt, strangely, like freedom. I thought of my granddaughter, of Leela's sketchbooks, of the lazy afternoons when Margaret would hum while washing dishes. For them, I would become an unpoetic kind of warrior. When I returned to the kitchen, Susan was already at her desk, making notes. She looked up and saw something in me she hadn't seen before. Hardness kept company with a kind of sorrow. She nodded once. "It's one thing to win in court," she said. "It's another to make the world remember." I understood the difference. Court orders could be reversed, lawsuits appealed. Memory, once seated publicly in a stubborn way, is harder to take back. So I said, "Make the world remember." She smiled then, small and dangerous, like a woman who knows how to plant a forest and watch it burn so new trees can grow. "We will begin with Victor," she said. "Then Alina will publish the papers. Rafik and Jess will have a piece ready in 24 hours. We will make the first move." It was a plan that smelled like thunder. I did not know, as I packed an overnight bag and locked the front door behind me, that the first move would change everything in a way none of us expected. The ledger Victor had given us had a final notation, scrawled in a handwriting I recognized immediately, Margaret's hand. It read, "If he breaks the law tonight, it will be the last noise he hears that belongs to him." It was not a threat. It was a promise of reciprocity. It meant she had known how they would act. She had planned not just for the bureaucratic victory but for the moral architecture of ruin. We were stepping into that design now, deliberate, terrible, and absolute. I started the car and drove toward the city, toward a press conference none of my neighbors could have imagined I would hold. I felt neither triumph nor pure malice. I felt the odd, hollow thing that arrives when a life you thought was measured in simple days reveals itself as a ledger of debts and credits that must be balanced. Outside the city limits my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost did not answer, but something made me tap the screen. His voice was a low rasp. "Did you really think you could take everything without cost?" it asked. I knew the voice before it named itself. It belonged to a man known in tangents of my past, a shadow who kept accounts in places that did not make sense on paper. Margaret had known him once long ago, when the world was a different sort of beast. "I don't want anything," I said, steady. "I just want the truth." "Sometimes truth," he said, a pity that gnawed, "is a country men will invade." He hung up. I breathed in and out, the sea wind from the quiet house growing thin in my lungs. The engine hummed. The first move had been made. The second would come before dawn. And in the rearview mirror, a small light appeared on the horizon, like a ship lighting an address. It moved quickly. The storm hadn't left quietly. It clawed through the night like a beast, rattling shutters and shaking the bluff beneath the house. By dawn, the world outside was a wreck of broken branches and foaming waves. Yet inside, I felt steadier than I had in years. The files lay sorted across the desk, Susan's neat handwriting marking each damning piece of evidence. Margaret had left me more than a home. She had left me a map out of submission, a torch against Daniel's darkness. But storms never pass without leaving shadows. That morning, as I brewed coffee strong enough to burn through the fog in my mind, a knock thundered at the door. Sharp, impatient. Not Susan, she always called first. Not a neighbor, no one lived close enough to bother. I opened the door and there he was. Daniel. Rain still slicked his jacket, his hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes were wild, pupils dilated with the cocktail of fury and desperation. He didn't even wait for an invitation. He pushed past me into the kitchen, his boots leaving dirty prints on Margaret's polished floor. "So this is it," he sneered, glancing around with the disdain of a man who couldn't stand to see beauty unless he owned it. "The hidden palace. No wonder she kept disappearing." His gaze landed on the files spread across the counter, and I saw the exact moment realization sliced through him. "You've been digging." I didn't answer. Silence is sometimes sharper than words. Daniel lunged forward, snatching at the folders, but I was quicker. My hand slammed them shut, palm flat, voice low but steady. "Touch them again and you'll regret it." He froze. For a second, just a second, I saw the boy he used to be, wide-eyed, unsure, caught stealing cookies before dinner. But the man he had become drowned that image almost instantly. His lip curled. "You think you can threaten me? At your age?" His laugh was venom, but beneath it I caught a crack of unease. "You don't know what you're playing with, old man. Those papers don't mean anything. I built my empire, me. Not you, not her." I leaned closer, my voice a whisper that cut through his bluster. "I know exactly what you built, Daniel, and I know what you stole to do it." The air thickened. He opened his mouth, but before he could spit more poison, another voice sliced through the tension. "Step back." Susan stood in the doorway, her briefcase in hand, eyes sharp as glass. She wasn't a large woman, but the weight she carried in her presence filled the room. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You," he hissed, "of course she'd bring you into this." Susan didn't flinch. She set her case on the table, flipping it open like a judge presenting the law itself. "You should leave, Daniel, before you say something that adds to the list of charges already lined against you." His laugh came again, but it was thinner this time, stretched tight over panic. He slammed a hand against the table, sending a cup crashing to the floor. "You think you can bury me? I'll drag you both down before that happens. Don't forget who I am." Susan's eyes flicked to me, then back to him. Her voice was calm, measured, but it carried a steel edge. "We haven't forgotten, But you should remember something, too. Pride has undone greater men than you." Daniel's nostrils flared. For a heartbeat, I thought he might strike her. But instead, he spun toward the door, his footsteps heavy with fury. Just before he left, he paused, glancing back at me. "This isn't over, Father. You've chosen sides, and when this burns, you'll burn with it." The door slammed. His car engine roared, tires screeching down the coastal road. Silence settled again, heavier this time. I sank into a chair, my hands trembling, not with fear but with the weight of what had just shifted. Daniel wasn't bluffing. He never bluffed, and if he felt cornered, he would lash out with teeth bared. Susan sat opposite me, folding her hands. "We don't have much time." "What do you mean?" She pulled a thin folder from her case, sliding it across the table. Inside were copies of documents I hadn't yet seen, leases, payments, false signatures. Daniel has been moving assets quietly, offshore accounts, hidden transfers. He's preparing to vanish if things collapse. If we don't act soon, he'll slip away with everything and the law won't catch him. I stared at the papers, bile rising in my throat. Margaret's foresight had given me the weapon, but Susan was giving me the battle plan. What do we do? Her eyes narrowed. "We tighten the net. I'll need to contact someone I trust, an investigator who doesn't scare easily, but you should prepare yourself. Once this begins, Daniel won't just fight back in court. He'll come for you personally." The storm outside had passed, but inside a new one brewed. That evening I walked the shoreline again, but the peace from before was gone. Every crashing wave sounded like a warning, every gull's cry like an omen. My mind wandered back to Margaret, her quiet strength, the way she had seen through Daniel's arrogance long before I had. She had tried to warn me, hadn't she? Tried to shield me. And now, even in death, she was still guiding my steps. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, I heard footsteps crunching on the sand. I turned, expecting Susan. It wasn't her. Carla, Daniel's wife, or rather, his accomplice. She stood barefoot on the shore, her designer dress whipping in the wind. Her eyes glittered with something between pity and malice. "Derichov," she said softly, almost kindly, "you don't understand what you've started." I held my ground. "What I've started? No, Carla. This began long before me. It began the moment you and Daniel decided greed mattered more than blood." She tilted her head, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "You think Daniel is the enemy, but he's only half the story." Her words lingered in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp. Before I could ask more, she turned and walked back toward the road, her silhouette fading into the dark. I stood there, heart pounding, the waves erasing her footprints one by one. Half the story. What did she mean? And just like that, I realized Margaret's files might not hold the whole truth. There was more, hidden still, more that could shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. And as the night closed in, I knew the real storm was only just beginning. I tasted salt and metal the morning everything broke. It was not a flavor I expected to savor, but there it was, bright on my tongue like warning. The phone had buzzed before dawn. Elena, terse, breathless, with the kind of news that makes your hands go numb. "They moved," she said. "He's trying to wire the last of it offshore. We have a narrow window." The window was the kind Margaret had taught me to live by. The smallest sliver of time when truth and luck and careful planning overlap. If you blink, it passes. If you hesitate, it's gone. I felt the old coil of steady work tighten in my chest. Years of being gentle and compliant had taught me the art of waiting. Margaret, in her final calculus, had given me more than documents. She had taught me patience so lethal it could dismantle men. We moved then, not with the lonely bravado of a man avenging slights, but with the slow, industrial precision of an orchestra tuning into a single, perfect note. Susan called the investigator she trusted, a quiet man named Anton, broad-shouldered with fingers like a mechanic who could fix anything that creaked. Victor arrived with the ledger tucked inside his coat like a relic. Elena sat with multiple screens open, each graph and line a finger pointing at the truth. Rafik and Jess had done their part. The local press knew we had fuel. They were ready to light the match. The first step was to trap the money in motion. Daniel had grown clever in his thievery. His transfers were a lacework of intermediaries and straw companies. He miscalculated, though. He left a habit. Men who steal for years build a pattern of convenience. Same bank, same cutoff times, the same person who moves the wires. Alina found the pattern, identified the courier bank, and fed that location into a formal request for an emergency freeze. By the time Daniel hit send on what he thought was the last transfer, his hands were moving into a cage. I watched him do it on a screen in real time. Alina's fingers flew. A sequence of calls, subpoenas, and legal motions whittled the world around his accounts until they sat still like fish in a bowl. It was technical ballet, dull to the untrained eye, but to me it was symphony. At 9:12 a.m. a notification blinked green, motion granted. The wire was intercepted. His offshore conduit failed. Daniel did not react with fury first. He reacted with disbelief, a dim recognition like someone who realizes the rug under his feet has been pulled away. He called every person who had ever vouched for him. They didn't pick up. His email lit up with messages marked urgent and action required. The empire he'd built on petty theft and arrogance began to stammer. That day we did something else, something small and savage. Victor drove to a diner Daniel frequented for business breakfasts. He paid in cash for a quiet table near the back and watched. The men Daniel did business with are the kind who treat discretion like a cost of doing business. One by one they arrived, nodding, laughing, exchanging envelopes. Victor, with the ledger and a camera taped under the table, caught them red-handed passing what was plainly cash for favors. Video, explicit and clean, does for reputation what a scalpel does for flesh. It reveals the wound. Susan moved on the legal front while Rafik and Jess positioned the narrative. They did not publish raw allegations. They published questions that mattered. How convenient, Rafik's piece began, that after a family funeral, a wholesale movement of assets would occur. The reporter phrased it like a scandal that asked for answers, not a witch hunt. The public wanted answers. The bank regulators wanted to know why money was vanishing into neat blind alleys. The supplier who'd earlier cut off Daniel called asking to rescind contracts. The walls Daniel had thought solid were porous. He lashed out when the pressure became public. The first strike was predictable, aggression through pseudo-legal channels. Amelia, the brittle lawyer, filed for a counterclaim, defamation, slander, the usual threats men in trouble use when their numbers are wrong. What she failed to anticipate was the load of evidence Susan had stacked in the courtroom. Invoices with duplicate numbers, deposit confirmations that pointed to shadow accounts, receipts with Daniel's handwriting where he had not thought to be careful. The judge, a man who had spent enough years watching human weakness parade as confidence, did not look kindly on obfuscation. The temporary freeze remained. An investigation began. The second strike was personal. Daniel turned his wrath toward anyone who supported me. He called advertisers. He threatened partners. He texted my grandson with bitter messages designed to turn blood against blood. He hired men to stand outside my coastal house at night, shadows with thermostats for faces, hopping to frighten me back into silence. They stayed until Victor and Anton, who knew how to make a problem disappear without trace, made them feel very small. Some things can be handled with words, others require hands. But it was the third strike, the thing I had predicted in less refined terms, that truly made the landscape fall into place. Daniel's panic clouded his judgment. He called an emergency meeting with a man he trusted to make hard things vanish, a financial fixer, the sort of man with a cold car and an even colder smile. The fixer promised a solution, an irreversible transfer that would put the money out of reach, far into a country with seals and red tape and a language of its own. It would take 48 hours and a sum of clean cash to grease the path. Susan set a trap. She let the fixer believe the money was on its way, an illusion crafted with a patience that felt like cruelty. Then she let him meet a man who had once been on the other side of many improvised solutions. Anton, who wore the lean patience of a man who has seen both ends and found legal ways to stop the middles. They met in a nondescript garage. Anton's camera was discreet. The fixer thought he was arranging a shift. Instead, he signed a confession of intent without realizing how binding paper can be. Later, the confession would sit under oath in a prosecutor's file and shine like a beacon. One of the cruelest instruments in any collapse is not law but reputation. Daniel's suppliers began protecting themselves. His little partnerships, pop-up investments, family-backed ventures, a charity with a glossy brochure that looked suspiciously like a money-laundering hub, began to falter. A major government client he once flirted with called to say their procurement office would be reviewing contracts. Board members who had once smiled thin smiles at his expense started to answer to different phone numbers. The most brutal public moment was an unplanned one. A local business association, worried about their own ties to a man under investigation, called an emergency luncheon. They invited Daniel to explain himself. He stood up, chest heaving, and tried to make a speech about devotion and legacy, about the sacrifices he had made for family. His voice trembled. He read the lines he'd prepared, the pictures on his social feed, the staged interactions for empathy. But the room had read Rafik's carefully published summary. The owners in the room had watched Jess's short documentary the night before, footage of ledgers, of a man handing cash over a diner table, and the friendly faces at the luncheon turned to the kind of cold interest you reserve for someone you used to know. The laughter that once lifted the room evaporated like smoke. Contracts were paused. Handshakes were withheld. He left under a drizzle of polite avoidance. When it all unraveled in that way, the final, personal damage unspooled like a rope pulled from a dock. Carla called, voice thin. She sounded like a woman who had signed a blank check with her name and found blood in the margins. "Please," she said, "we can fix this. We can make mistakes, we can apologize, we can. But apologies cost something in a bank. They do not mend drains where money has already run." I listened, and in her plea I heard the precise clatter of people who had once chosen self over family, finally confronting the bill. In the middle of this ruin, something tender happened that had nothing to do with paperwork and had everything to do with the human heart. My grandson, a child who had been used as a pawn by desperation, came to the house with a small canvas he had painted. Leela's eyes were big, not quite the same as everyone else's. Children understand things too early. She pressed the painting into my hands. A crooked sun, two stick figures walking a path, a small blue house at the edge of the world. "For Grandpa," she said. Her innocence felt like a tether. It kept me from making the kind of final unkindness that leaves the rest of life bitter. The legal case advanced. Depositions were taken, testimonies recorded. Daniel's lawyer kept trying to frame the narrative as a family disagreement misread by opportunists. The press, for a while, loved the romance of a family trial. But our evidence was a hammer. Elena produced a ledger trail so tight that even the most practiced denials sounded like paper boats in a storm. By midweek, the prosecutor's office called to say they were opening a criminal inquiry into possible embezzlement and wire fraud. The words felt simple but enormous. They meant that the law might finally treat his actions not as a domestic squabble, but as crimes with consequences. It all came to a head on a rainy Tuesday, the kind that makes the world look like it has been washed of color. The courthouse steps were slick. Cameras clustered like flies. I kept my head down. Susan and I walked up the stone approach together, our shoulders almost touching. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. I felt exhausted by the scale of cruelty and the way it had seeped into rooms I once thought were sacred. Inside, Daniel sat at the defense table, hands clenched as though for prayer. For the first time in months, he looked old. His voice, when he was called to testify, broke. He tried to put pieces together into a narrative that made sense, pressure, decisions made in the heat of desperation. The prosecutor did not let him off easily. She read transactions aloud like inventory. Each number had a face now. A payroll changed into a betrayal. A dinner expense turned into evidence. The words piled until the air felt full of small noises that sounded like judgment. When they escorted him out, he looked at me in a way I had not seen before, raw, stripped of armor, smaller than any of us had imagined. The cameras wanted a line, a moment of spectacle. I had been given many opportunities to shout vindication, to let rage pour from me like a confession. I did not. I stood where Margaret had taught me to stand, quiet, firm. The justice I wanted was not the spectacle of a man broken under cameras. It was the slow, inevitable accounting that would keep him from stealing someone else's dignity again. After the hearing, the last papers were signed. Accounts were frozen. Contracts were revoked. The man who'd once told me I was next now had no comfortable next. The fixer, the banker with shady smiles, and a few of Daniel's most willing partners all found themselves called into rooms where words like indictment and seizure floated in the air. The fall was not total theater. It was bureaucratic, relentless, and real. I watched as men I had seen in boardrooms scramble for explanations that did not hold up under the steady light of evidence. People who had once shown up to fancy dinners with him now returned phone calls with questions and pauses, the sort of silence that felt like the beginning of obituaries for reputations. The press filmed, took notes, and left. In its wake, my life was quieter, battered but intact. At dusk that evening, I walked down to the bluff behind the house to watch the ocean draw itself flat and dark. The wind pulled at my coat like an old friend. Victor sat on a rock with a thermos, his hands rough and sure. Elena came down with her laptop, closed it with a sigh of release. Susan lit a cigarette and let the smoke curl into the air. We did not celebrate. There was a hollow where triumph might have been. Justice does not fill that hollow, it makes space. My phone buzzed once. It was Carla. She left a voice message, voice trembling. "We are sorry," she said simply, and then the message broke off. I deleted it. There was no satisfaction in her regret. I had watched the damage intimately. There was, instead, a slow understanding that choices collate into consequence. Margaret had given me the chance to be more than a materially dispossessed man. She had given me the chance to be a man who would not allow his name to be erased by greed. A week later, Daniel went to court for arraignment. The charges were serious: embezzlement, wire fraud, conspiracy. They read them in a small room that smelled of paper and disinfectant. He stood in the box and his face did not show much. The judge set bail impossibly high. He would not be walking out of that building with a swagger anytime soon. When the door clicked shut behind him, the house seemed to breathe differently. My house, Margaret's house, held a light that belonged to both of us. The second house, the one on the bluff, hummed like a new heart. I thought of Leela's painting, Crooked Sun and all. I thought of the small, private rituals I would have now. Early mornings with coffee and wind, afternoons with a book and a chair angled toward the sea. I thought about forgiveness, and how it never arrives as a single gesture, but as a slow folding back of life into itself. There were consequences I had not wanted. There was shame and ruin that spilled onto the doorstep of people who may have begun as minor actors and ended as villains. There was grief for the parts of my family that could not be mended by evidence and court orders alone. I could not pretend that the ending I had arranged would be tidy. On my last walk that week, I passed by the small gazebo where the town posted notices for lost pets and volunteer meetings. A neighbor I hardly knew, Mrs. Klein, was sweeping the path. She looked up and handed me a plate of cookies wrapped in wax paper, gesture simple and human. "For you," she said. "You did good." Her words were not about revenge. They were about balance. That night I cooked for the first time in years without thinking about someone else's approval. I made a small stew of things Margaret loved and opened a bottle of wine she used to save for anniversaries. I set the table for one and sat, feeling the ache and the quiet bloom in the same breath. Justice had come with a price. I had paid it. The ledger was balanced, at least on paper. Before bed, I took Margaret's letter from the drawer and read the last line again. "Let them find out what small looks like when it is prepared." I chuckled softly. She had always been hungry for poetry. As I locked the door and turned off the lights, my phone buzzed one final time. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered, wary. The voice on the other end was old and softer than the threat earlier in the month. "Mr. Derichov," it said, "there are some men who will never learn to be small, but there are others, quieter ones, who will watch and learn. You did well." Then the line went dead. I stood in the dark a long time and let the silence envelope me like an old coat. The storm had passed. The sea hummed. In the deep of the night, I understood that Margaret had done what she had always wanted. She had given me the tools not only to reclaim what was mine, but to build a life around the truth that dignity is not given, it is defended. When dawn came, it felt ordinary and miraculous, like the world itself forgave me for having to wage war. I poured coffee, opened the curtains, and watched the horizon glow. The revenge had been epic in its consequences, careful in its execution, and finally, as Margaret had promised, it had made a certain kind of smallness into something sacred. I was not a man who had wanted ruin. I was a man who had wanted to be seen. That could be, it turned out, the most costly and most beautiful thing one could demand.